It might not be long until humans leave for the stars and never come back. The idea of colonizing space has fascinated us. With films like Star Wars, Interstellar, Star Trek, The Martian, you name it, it's been a key part of our popular culture, and in the somewhat near future, it might become a part of our actual culture. With SpaceX and other companies now pushing forward the technology to make space exploration easier and perhaps one day space colonization possible, it's worth actually asking why. Elon Musk has called colonizing Mars humanity's life insurance.
That's one of the benefits of Mars, is life insurance for life collectively.
But what about the opposite view? A view that rarely gets any airtime. And that's not just that we shouldn't prioritize colonizing space, but that we should actively avoid it. That it wouldn't just be unnecessary, it could be catastrophic. In this video, I'm going to explore the antinatalist case against space colonization. So let's get into it. So briefly, what is antinatalism? Antinatalism is the view that it's morally wrong to create sentient beings. Don't bring life into existence, basically. Life that can suffer anyway. So the three main reasons that antinatalists are morally opposed to creating new sentient beings is because when you create a child, that imposes suffering on them, quite significant suffering, without their consent. You gamble with their life such that they never existed and now they could lead a life that is really bad. And creating a child exposes them to all of this suffering and risk, which is a bad thing to do, when if the alternative had remained of them never existing, that would have been entirely unproblematic. Okay, but how does antinatalism actually relate to space colonization? Well, it's not just as simple as humans go space, humans procreate in space, procreation bad, space colonization bad. There are actually four main areas of concern that I'm going to go into. The first is that people who are born into a life that is going to be exclusively or predominantly spent living in space are going to face space-specific harms on top of the general harms that they will experience through just existing. The second one, and we're going to go into all of these in detail, but the second one is the fact that there will likely be increased human reproduction in space. And then the third and fourth are the fact that we might cause panspermia to occur, which is when life gets taken from one place to another. And we might do that indirectly by accident, or we might do that directly intentionally. So let's start with the space-specific harms. So the reasons that I've just gone over for taking an antinatalist position on any individual life actually become even more pressing when you think about them in the context of the space environment. In his book, The Bioethics of Space Exploration, Konrad Szocik discusses the quality of life in the space environment. Another problem is the difficulty of living in space with constant high exposure to cosmic radiation, in difficult conditions of altered gravity, constant stress, enclosed spaces. It can be said that the quality of such a life will be very low, where people simply persist and higher pleasures will simply be impossible to realize. On top of the list Konrad gives, you've got stuff like a hard vacuum or extreme temperatures or hazardous debris just floating around. And then among those harsh conditions for actually living your life, you've got the impact of them on birth and the process of a child developing as well. Children born in space colonies or on spaceships are likely going to face complications from altered gravity, radiation exposure, and a disrupted day-night cycle. Then you've got the fact that life in space in many instances is likely to be tightly controlled, and many individuals are going to have little freedom to shape their life's future. And all of what I've just said is layered on top of the usual harms like bereavement, illness, loneliness, and all the other things that generally afflict us while we live our lives on Earth. And none of this is consented to by the person being brought into existence. So that's the quality of individual lives in space. But now, what about the likelihood of increased human reproduction? Colonizing space would likely massively increase our capacity for reproduction, both in that it would likely extend the time that our species is around, but also that it would just simply increase the terrain over which we exist and the resources that we have access to. Yes, someone could say, well, Earth has plenty of resources for an even larger population than it has today, and yet we already see declining birth rates. And that's true, and ultimately we won't know exactly how the future is going to go. But the worst case scenarios, or even just possible bad scenarios, could be put on steroids if our species does leave to colonize space. Take one of those possible futures. There are technologies already in development like exowombs that would remove our own reproductive systems from the process of procreation. And if technologies like this become widespread, it could significantly increase the number of people brought into existence because it would remove a limiting factor, our reproductive systems. And this could proliferate the creation of new people, even even with just a small group of concerted people behind the effort, like a government that's trying to build an army, or a corporation that needs workers, or simply a deranged pronatalist that thinks that it's good to bring as many people into existence as possible. Again, ultimately we don't know what the future will hold, but even though the future is uncertain, the scale of possible suffering and the number of beings that could be created in the future is far greater once humanity leaves Earth. To get an idea of the potential scale here, you could read Nick Bostrom's essay Astronomical Waste: The Opportunity Cost of Delayed Technological Development. Suppose that about 10 to the 10 biological humans could be sustained around an average star. Then the Virgo supercluster could contain 10 to the 23 biological humans. This corresponds to a loss of potential of over 10 to the 13 potential human lives per second of delayed colonization. What matters for present purposes is not the exact numbers, but the fact that they are huge. Even with the most conservative estimate, assuming a biological implementation of all persons, the potential for over 10 trillion potential human beings is lost for every second of postponement of colonization of our supercluster. Now, Bostrom and others obviously write from the perspective that they think it's good to bring someone into existence and bring about such a future. Some of them even seem to verge on masturbating over the possibility of bringing as many people into existence as possible, metaphorically, of course. Now, I'm not talking about Bostrom specifically here, but it's these types of views and these types of people that could be the ones that, if the technology were to be in their hands, like exowombs, they could naively bring about this future that is ripe for catastrophe. And whilst it likely wouldn't be their intention to bring about a really bad situation, many of the lives that they would want to bring about could live in the conditions that I was talking about earlier. Now let's talk about panspermia. By panspermia, I basically mean the spreading of non-human life that originates on Earth to other planets. And like I said before, this can be unintentional and intentional. We could purposefully take non-human animals to colonies for agriculture, experimentation, or terraforming, for example. And in that case, we'd likely be breeding them or facilitating their breeding in some involved way. If you want to dive deeper into this and look at the potential future suffering it could cause, then I'd recommend checking out Michael Dello Icavo's essay on terraforming, wild animal suffering, and the far future. That's also linked in the description. But we could also unintentionally spread life as well. Non-human life could be spread off Earth accidentally by our other space activities. It would likely be microbial life stuck to the surfaces of things, and that would be a more long-term concern that we would see Darwinian evolution somewhere else. But it could also be if space travel becomes wide-scale and common enough that small rodents and other animals can stow away in spaceships that are leaving Earth. And obviously this is something antinatalists would want to avoid, especially since non-human animals tend to have worse lives than humans. And the fact that this form of life proliferation could actually end up being much worse than human reproduction. If you want to look more into the ethics of panspermia, there is a paper called To Seed or Not to Seed, estimating the ethical value of directed panspermia by Asher Sorrell and Anders Sandberg. Again, linked in the description. They don't really consider antinatalism, and I doubt either of them are antinatalists, but even so, they conclude the following. This paper has argued against attempting directed panspermia on the grounds that it has negative expected value in the short term, conditional on there being other viable solutions to address the problem of existential risk. This is primarily because of its potential to create astronomical levels of suffering if the biospheres resulting from our actions convergently evolve sentient life. This risk could be reduced with a better understanding of the natural dynamics of welfare and access to sufficient technology. Therefore, we encourage further research on the problems that we have outlined to support the development of mutually agreeable solutions. Until then, we propose a moratorium on the development of panspermia technologies, at least until we have a clear strategy for their implementation without risking the creation of astronomical suffering. And I think this makes the antinatalist case even stronger. Not only would a monumental number of new beings be created, but they could very possibly have awful lives. And very quickly, before we go on to the next section, if people are really interested in this idea of accidentally facilitating the creation of sentient life, then there is one other essay I want to point people towards from the EA forum, which is The Case for Fruit Fly Antinatalism by Daniel Daymoon. Now, it's not on the topic of space colonization specifically, but if you have a read of it, you'll realize the parallels with panspermia. With that said, let's move on. All in all, the colonization of space poses a grave moral risk. Every act of procreation already carries the imposition of serious harm and risk, but in the context of space colonization, the sheer number of beings that could be brought into existence is staggering. And obviously the future of life on Earth itself is likely to involve widespread suffering and injustice, but if our species were to leave Earth and colonize space, this would raise the stakes significantly. In his book Avoiding the Worst: How to Prevent Moral Catastrophe, Tobias Baumann actually warns of this. Space colonization, even with the best of intentions, poses significant risks. The potential scale of future civilization is mind-boggling. A future moral catastrophe on a galactic or intergalactic scale could therefore exceed Earth-based suffering by many orders of magnitude. By contrast, the amount of suffering is limited if we never expand into space. This astronomical scope is a strong reason to take the risk of worst-case outcomes seriously, even if the likelihood remains unclear. And in their paper Space Colonization and Suffering Risks, Reassessing the Max Epoch Rule, Phil Torres outlines several ways in which space colonization could produce such catastrophic outcomes that could be entirely avoided if we didn't leave Earth. I'm not going to go into them in massive detail here, so if you want to, you can read his paper, and there's a summary of it and a response paper, and I've linked them all in the description. But in summary, colonizing space could set in motion scenarios like complex space wars, catastrophic life support system failures, a breakdown in law enforcement due to the sheer scale of the distances between different places, and even just random unforeseen circumstances that lead to mass death or severe hardship in the harsh space environment. But these are all quite grandiose, large-scale things that can maybe lead us to become detached from the impact on the individual. And this is a concern that Brian Tomasic has raised in his essay, Omelas and Space Colonization. The instances of extreme suffering in the world are so numerous that they sometimes blur together in a blob of abstraction. It can help to pick out a single instance of cruelty to avoid mind-numbing statistics, even though we should realize that the situation of our world is far worse than the suffering of a single individual. Take this one. Turkish girl, 16, buried alive for talking to boys. Turkish police have recovered the body of a 16-year-old girl they say was buried alive by relatives in an honor killing carried out as punishment for talking to boys. The girl, who has been identified only by the initials of MM, was found in a sitting position with her hands tied in a 2-meter hole dug under a chicken pen outside her home in Qatar, in the southeastern province of Adiyaman. Media reports say that the father has told relatives he was unhappy that his daughter, one of 9 children, had male friends. The grandfather is said to have beaten her for having relations with the opposite sex. A post-mortem examination revealed large amounts of soil in her lungs and stomach, indicating that she had been alive and conscious while being buried. You might say, okay, but how does this relate to space colonization? Colonizers are not burying people alive. No, but by astronomically expanding the number of conscious minds in the future, colonizers are opening the doors for enormous numbers of more beings to have experiences at least this awful and possibly far worse. If you would not cause severe suffering to someone to bring new happy people into existence, why would you set the stage for natural and social forces to do that on your behalf? Of course, these things may not happen, but the key point is that they might. And if there's a chance that they could happen, especially on the larger scale that would be facilitated by space colonization, then it's probably better that we avoid it altogether. In other words, let's not tempt fate by colonizing space. Right now, we still have control over whether we pursue large-scale space colonization. So this is very relevant to us here and now. And if it isn't clear enough how this relates to antinatalism, let's put a more finer point on it. Of course, it isn't just antinatalists that are concerned about a potential for a very bad future that's full of suffering or that relies on the intense suffering of a few individuals. But you might notice that what is being said is essentially a risk argument for antinatalism, just conceived of on a population scale rather than an individual scale. There's the risk that a child we create or their future descendants will live intolerable lives, and so it's more responsible to simply never create them, since their non-existence is not going to be problematic for them. And this is something that Konrad Szocik noted on in his book, Feminist Bioethics in Space, Gender Inequality in Space Exploration. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, one of the worst possible future scenarios, and let us assume that at least a few 100 million of the poorest inhabitants of the most effective parts of Earth will have lives not worth living. These people do not yet exist. knowing that some future humans will have lives not worth living, is it not better that they never come into the world? An antinatalist case against space colonization works to avoid these worst case scenarios. It lessens the number of people that could face any worst case scenarios, and there wouldn't be anyone deprived of their not being born because they don't exist. So obviously this all has practical implications. There would need to be changes to international treaties, national legislation, and industry regulations. And obviously given the current context, this is a field that is actively evolving anyway. To get a sense of what an antinatalist approach to these issues would look like, let's have a look at Rehan Visser's paper, Keeping Our Eggs in Earth's Basket, the Antinatalist Case Against Space Colonization. In it, he offers suggestions for how our current system could be changed to align with an antinatalist approach to space colonization. In the absence of a clear international space law framework on the subject of space colonization, and given the gargantuan harms that would result were space colonization to take place, it behooves me to suggest a new policy framework. This framework can be administered as all 5 previous space law treaties have been administered. That is, it can be deposited by at least one UN member state, signed and ratified by the rest of the member states, and entered into force as soon as it is feasible. As with the other treaties, this declaration can fall under the auspices of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And his first of these suggestions is this: the guiding principle for space-related activities must be planetary confinement. Amendments should be made to all the annexes of the current treaties to reflect this guiding principle. Any new policies drawn up should also include it. A possible addition to the introduction of the treaties could be recognizing the harms and uncertainties attending permanent occupation of outer space, both for humankind and any sentient extraterrestrial life. He also clarifies that some limited space activity could be permitted for scientific research, for education, and maybe some other legitimate purposes as well. But permanent human habitation in space shouldn't be allowed. As of writing this, there are 3 astronauts in outer space, all of whom are residing on the International Space Station. The ISS serves as a platform to carry out scientific research. It also engages in educational outreach by involving schoolgoers in scientific experiments and demonstrations. Finally, it allows for private expeditions into outer space. Although one can ask questions about the cost effectiveness of the creation and maintenance of the ISS, there appears to be no a priori moral reason to prohibit astronauts or other adventurers from going there to perform these activities. Of course, under an antinatalist approach, there would likely be tighter regulation. For example, prohibiting sexual activity that could result in pregnancy during missions. Maybe those involved in space missions would have to be on contraception for the duration of their mission. And any activities in space would need to have stricter oversight as well. Questions would need to be asked like, are these activities really necessary? Have proper precautions been taken to not accidentally spread life elsewhere? And can this mission be unmanned? Visser then has a second proposal which is more direct. A new treaty with the proposals I suggest here should be drawn up and put before the UN General Assembly. The first thing that this treaty should do is explicitly prohibit the formation of a space colony of any kind. This has several implications. One is that the treaty should specifically forbid procreation in outer space, perhaps citing unknown health risks such as those stemming from exposure to radiation. Signatories to this treaty must agree to alter their domestic laws to make procreation in outer space a punishable offence. I would counsel a stiff penalty, such as a lengthy prison sentence, for contravening this law. A second consequence of the prohibition on space colonization would be that anyone who goes missing in action and misses their return flight to Earth, or otherwise attempts to escape a space station anywhere in outer space, would also face punishment. Again, I would recommend a similarly stiff sentence for the offender. And perhaps most importantly, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs and the Secretariat to the COPUOS needs a means of enforcing these laws, especially since the most likely transgressor of such a treaty would be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. But the thing is that Visser expresses that these reforms are very unlikely to be implemented. Because of widespread fervent opposition to antinatalist doctrine, the chances of a planetary confinement policy succeeding, never mind one motivated by a belief in the goodness of human extinction, is effectively zero. The only way that I can foresee a policy in this vein being adopted and adhered to is A, the hazards of living in outer space, including the harms of human procreation, are judged to be too severe, or B, the world's superpowers entertain a mutual fear that one of the others will be the first to conquer outer space, and so will move to keep one another in check. Even if both of these conditions hold true, however, I'm not hopeful that space colonization will be prevented. It seems likely that the harms of radiation exposure and other hazards of living in space will one day be minimized to a sufficient degree in the eyes of would-be space dwellers. And it is also likely that B will lead not only to efforts to prevent other nations from participating in the space settlement race, but also the active attempts to win it by being the first to colonize space. If you want to do a deeper dive into this topic of the antinatalist case against space colonization, then I've linked all the resources I've used for this video in the description below. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you ever even thought of the ethics of space colonization? And I'll see you in the next one.